Hey, friends! I'm Megan, so glad you're here. We've got a great episode today. Let's get started.
Every morning, she woke to the quiet hum of the apartment, the way sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors in a lazy, golden arc, and the faint aroma of coffee that he had already brewed hours before. She moved through the routine of her day almost obliviously, assuming the stability and comfort of their shared life as something that simply existed, never pausing to acknowledge the deliberate care behind each small act. He left notes on the counter, reminders of errands or gentle words of encouragement, each one written in careful penmanship that revealed both thoughtfulness and patience. She skimmed past them, assuming they were ordinary, not recognizing the intentional kindness that went into crafting them, the subtle ways he worked to maintain her happiness without complaint or demand. When she was frustrated over trivial inconveniences, he would listen attentively, never raising his voice, never letting irritation leak through his calm demeanor, offering perspective rather than judgment. She often criticized her own discomforts, convinced that they were inconveniences worthy of attention, never considering the way he consistently absorbed the tension in silence, shielding her from its weight. On weekends, while she indulged in hobbies and personal errands, he took on the mundane responsibilities that kept the household functioning, washing dishes, tending laundry, repairing minor damages, and running errands that she could have done herself but that he anticipated with quiet devotion. She rarely noticed these contributions, focusing instead on her own schedule and desires, unconsciously cataloging grievances instead of recognizing the ongoing generosity of his actions. Even when she returned home exhausted from work or social obligations, she found the apartment orderly and welcoming, food prepared or planned, and his presence steady and patient, always accommodating her rhythms without complaint. She took for granted the emotional labor he performed, the unspoken attentiveness to her moods, the intuitive support when she faced challenges at work, and the gentle encouragement when she doubted her own decisions. She assumed his actions were standard, ordinary, and deserved, never pausing to appreciate the rare depth of empathy and selflessness they represented. Friends often remarked on her partner's patience and attentiveness, noting how he remembered small details about her life, anticipated her needs, and consistently acted with her best interests in mind. She would smile politely at their comments, nodding in acknowledgement but failing to internalize the rarity and value of such devotion, as her worldview had normalized it. In social situations, she observed how he handled disagreements with composure, diffused tension with tact, and ensured everyone felt heard and respected, yet she remained focused on her own minor frustrations or unacknowledged gestures, blind to the disproportionate care he provided. At night, when the lights dimmed and the city's hum softened, she often drifted off to sleep without fully recognizing the subtle ways he had structured the day to ensure her comfort, the sacrifices made in silence to prioritize her well-being over his own convenience. She failed to notice how he balanced his own needs with hers, consistently deferring in small ways to reduce her stress, never complaining, never recording grievances, never keeping score. It was a life filled with quiet, extraordinary generosity, yet she saw it as ordinary, taking for granted the countless ways he enriched her daily existence without demand or expectation. In moments when she felt impatient or irritable, he offered space, understanding, and patience beyond what she realized, creating a buffer between her emotional turbulence and the world, allowing her to navigate life without the weight of conflict or constant discomfort. She ignored these contributions, attributing the smoothness of her life to luck, circumstance, or her own effort, rarely acknowledging that his presence and actions were the true foundation of her stability. She assumed his kindness was inexhaustible, a permanent fixture in her life, never considering that it was a conscious, rare choice, exercised daily and requiring thought, restraint, and consistent empathy. As the days unfolded, the rhythm of his attentive actions continued, almost invisible, and she maintained her obliviousness, unaware that each act of patience, each gesture of care, and each silent sacrifice was a deliberate testament to his rare character. She catalogued complaints, minor frustrations, and inconveniences with care, yet overlooked the profound magnitude of his daily kindness. Each overlooked note, each dismissed offer of help, each unacknowledged effort contributed to an unconscious pattern of taking him for granted, reinforcing her perception that his care was ordinary, expected, and inexhaustible. In her mind, the life they shared was simply the life she deserved, and she moved through the routines of morning, afternoon, and evening without once measuring the extraordinary constancy, the deliberate attention, or the quiet devotion that sustained the world she inhabited. She failed to see that each act, no matter how small, was a choice, and that the patience, empathy, and dedication he displayed daily were not universal, not commonplace, and not guaranteed. The rare and precious nature of his kindness remained invisible to her, obscured by the normalized lens through which she viewed their life together, setting the stage for the eventual realization that what she had taken for granted was truly extraordinary. Her ignorance of his consistent generosity created a fragile equilibrium, a silent tension that she had yet to recognize, and it was only a matter of time before the full weight of this oversight would surface, forcing her to confront both the depth of his kindness and the consequences of her inattentiveness. As days turned into weeks, the subtle patterns of his generosity continued, often unnoticed and underappreciated. She moved through her routines, occupied with work deadlines, social obligations, and personal ambitions, scarcely aware of the quiet attentions that sustained her emotional and practical life. He anticipated her needs without ever announcing them, preparing meals she preferred, adjusting the thermostat to her comfort, and quietly managing tasks she considered trivial, yet which prevented small irritations from growing into conflicts. In her mind, these actions were expected, automatic, and almost invisible, mere background noise to the louder, more immediate demands of her own life. She overlooked the thoughtfulness in every decision he made on her behalf, the intentional effort behind his patience when she was stressed or irritable, and the sacrifices he quietly absorbed to maintain harmony. At work, when she returned home exhausted or overwhelmed, she found the house in order and his attention undiminished, yet she rarely reflected on the emotional labor he performed. She catalogued her frustrations, the minor annoyances of delayed dinners, misplaced keys, or the occasional irritation at his cautious approach, but never paused to recognize the extraordinary constancy with which he managed every small disruption for her benefit. Friends occasionally remarked on his kindness, noting how he remembered small details about her life, how he listened without judgment, and how he went out of his way to create stability and comfort. Yet she responded with half smiles and nods, unconcerned with the rarity and significance of these gestures. On weekends, while she sought moments of leisure and self-indulgence, he quietly ensured the household functioned seamlessly, attending to errands, maintenance, and responsibilities that, while invisible to her, prevented accumulated stress. She failed to perceive the conscious thoughtfulness behind every act, the care taken to anticipate her needs and protect her from inconveniences she would have found irritating or burdensome. Emotional support, which he provided daily without complaint, remained unacknowledged. When she encountered setbacks at work or personal challenges, he offered measured advice, encouragement, and patience, never insisting, never expressing frustration, and never expecting recognition in return. She assumed it was his natural disposition, a given, and never considered that sustaining such a level of care required constant mindfulness, emotional energy, and deliberate choice. In social gatherings, his attentive nature became more apparent to outsiders. He remembered stories she had casually mentioned, anticipated her moods, and offered small comforts without making them feel obligatory. She observed this behavior but interpreted it through the lens of normalcy, failing to appreciate the uniqueness of his generosity and the rare patience it demanded. Minor conflicts, such as disagreements about household priorities or her fleeting irritations, were consistently met with calm negotiation and understanding, diffusing tension with thoughtfulness she had come to expect. Her perception remained focused on her own inconveniences and desires, never weighing them against the scale of his continuous care. Gradually, she began to notice faint signs of his subtle disappointment. A sigh left unspoken, a gesture hesitated, a smile that did not reach his eyes. Yet, she dismissed these cues as fleeting or insignificant, not recognizing that they were the first indications of emotional fatigue born from her ongoing inattention. She catalogued her minor grievances, measured her impatience, and remained preoccupied with her own life's pressures, blind to the cumulative toll her indifference exacted on his spirit. Each unacknowledged act of kindness created a pattern of invisibility in which his efforts went unremarked and underappreciated, and yet he continued to give, to care, to prioritize her comfort above his own. Quietly and consistently, she began to notice moments where he paused, allowed space for himself, or refrained from his usual attentiveness, but she interpreted these changes as temporary or circumstantial, not realizing that they were the first cracks in the foundation of unconditional support she had taken for granted. The pattern of giving and unacknowledged generosity established a fragile imbalance. He continued to offer, she continued to overlook, and the equilibrium of their relationship quietly shifted. Her obliviousness to the extraordinary patience, the deliberate forethought, and the emotional constancy he demonstrated every day concealed the gravity of what she risked losing. The accumulation of small, unnoticed gestures formed a foundation for their life together, a structure so strong yet so invisible that she assumed it was indestructible. She failed to understand that each act of care, each moment of attention, was a conscious choice, a rare and precious quality that, if undervalued, could eventually recede. Over time, the weight of her unawareness grew. While she remained immersed in her routines, he carried the quiet responsibility for both their comfort and the emotional health of their relationship. His willingness to absorb stress, manage conflict, and anticipate her needs without recognition created an invisible safety net, a buffer that she assumed would always be there. The reality, however, was that sustaining such generosity demanded continuous effort and emotional resilience, qualities she had yet to fully comprehend. Small instances of minor frustration or irritation on her part began to accumulate unobserved, and subtle shifts in his behavior, which she misread or ignored, presaged the eventual reckoning that would force her to confront the rarity and significance of his kindness. Every unnoticed gesture, every overlooked act of care, and every instance of patience contributed to a growing undercurrent of imbalance that she could neither see nor measure, setting the stage for a future moment of clarity and regret when the magnitude of what she had taken for granted would become undeniably apparent. The turning point arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the way he began to pull back, not abruptly, not in anger, but with a measured, cautious reserve that she had never noticed before. At first, it was subtle, a missed note on the kitchen counter, a delayed response to a text, a pause before offering help with a task she had always assumed would be done instantly. She noticed these changes with fleeting irritation, attributing them to busy schedules, stress at work, or temporary lapses, never realizing that they were deliberate signals, small but intentional adjustments marking a shift in his engagement. The cumulative weight of his previous unacknowledged patience and kindness had reached a threshold, and he was now beginning to conserve his emotional energy in response to the ongoing invisibility of his efforts. It was a natural response to repeated underappreciation, a quiet assertion of boundaries that she had failed to recognize as necessary and rare. she began to feel a subtle emptiness in the daily interactions she had once taken for granted. The warmth of his smile seemed slightly tempered, the attentiveness she relied upon felt measured, and the small gestures that had been her invisible safety net now required deliberate effort on her part to evoke. In the silence of these shifts, she started to perceive, perhaps for the first time, the magnitude of what she had been overlooking: the constancy of his presence, the intentionality behind every supportive action, and the rarity of someone who gave so freely without demand or complaint. The recognition hit gradually, like a tide seeping through the cracks of her complacency. She had assumed that his patience, his understanding, and his unwavering attention were inexhaustible, permanent fixtures of her life, yet now they seemed finite, contingent on acknowledgement and reciprocity. As she observed the subtle changes, she began to reflect on instances she had previously dismissed: long hours he spent helping her organize tasks she could have managed alone, the way he anticipated emotional lows and mitigated them with quiet, almost invisible support, and the countless ways he had structured his own desires and priorities around hers without complaint or expectation. Each realization compounded her regret, and she felt a growing awareness that these were not ordinary acts of kindness, but a rare blend of empathy, patience, and commitment that few people could sustain over time. Social interactions revealed another layer of the consequences. Friends began to comment on his distant demeanor, noting that he seemed quieter, less inclined to offer assistance or advice, and more reserved in his interactions with her. She realized that his patience had been visible to others even if it was invisible to her, and that the foundation of admiration and respect he had quietly built in their social circle remained intact for outsiders, but was now under threat from her continued neglect. The contrast between how others perceived him and how she had treated him intensified the sense of guilt and self-reproach, highlighting the extraordinary nature of his generosity and the ease with which she had taken it for granted. In moments alone, she replayed conversations, gestures, and shared experiences, noticing for the first time the intentional choices he had made to prioritize her well-being over his own comfort or convenience. Each memory underscored the rarity of his character, the countless small acts of care, the patience he exhibited in moments of irritation, the support he offered without expectation of recognition, and the constancy of his attention, all of it forming a tapestry of generosity she had assumed was ordinary. The turning point crystallized in a particular incident, perhaps minor to an outsider but monumental to her, a moment where she expected his automatic assistance, his customary patience, or his unspoken support, and it was absent, delayed, or restrained. The impact was immediate and profound. She felt the vacuum created by his subtle withdrawal, a tangible emptiness in the routines she had relied upon, and a stark realization of the fragility of what she had assumed indestructible. The emotional weight of this moment forced introspection. She began to see the pattern of her own negligence, the blind spots in her gratitude, and the cumulative toll her lack of acknowledgement had taken on someone who had consistently given without complaint. The realization was accompanied by a complex mix of guilt, regret, and dawning admiration for the constancy she had ignored. She recognized that his kindness was not infinite, that the quiet reserves of patience and generosity she had exploited were finite, and that each unacknowledged act had slowly eroded the unspoken foundation of trust and intimacy that had sustained their relationship. As the days following this turning point unfolded, she observed a continued, careful retraction. He offered less, waited longer before acting, and became increasingly selective in the moments where he invested effort. Each observation deepened her understanding of the rarity of his kindness and the consequences of her previous inattention. She began to measure the weight of his absence not in grand gestures but in the subtle shifts, the tiny withdrawals that collectively reshaped the emotional landscape of their life together. In her mind, a map of all the small, invisible ways he had supported her unfurled, the thoughtfulness of his actions, the patience in his responses, ease, the constancy in his presence. The clarity was both illuminating and painful. She recognized that she had been blind to the extraordinary nature of his character, taking for granted the rare and delicate balance he had maintained. The chapter closed with a dawning awareness that her continued oversight might irrevocably alter the depth of connection they shared, and that the realization of what she had lost or was in danger of losing would define the trajectory of their relationship. The rare kindness she had relied upon without acknowledgement was now visible in its absence, and the gravity of this understanding marked the beginning of profound introspection and emotional reckoning. The realization settled over her slowly, like a shadow creeping across familiar terrain, soft at first but impossible to ignore. She began to trace back through the months and years, recalling moments of quiet generosity, gestures performed without acknowledgement, and instances of patience that had seemed ordinary at the time. She saw, with fresh clarity, the ways he had structured his life around hers, often silently absorbing stress, discomfort, or inconvenience to maintain harmony and ease. Every morning he prepared coffee or breakfast with no expectation of thanks. Every minor household chore he completed without fanfare. Every instance of emotional support he offered in the background. These were not trivial acts, but deliberate choices made from a reservoir of empathy and love that she had previously taken for granted. The weight of recognition brought an ache she could not shake, a mixture of guilt, shame, and awe at the constancy of his care. She now understood that his actions were rare, that the patience and attentiveness he displayed required conscious effort and were not to be assumed as infinite. As she revisited these memories, she noticed the countless small sacrifices that had gone unnoticed, the times he postponed personal interests to accommodate her schedule, the quiet adjustments he made to his own comfort for her happiness, and the emotional labor he undertook to shield her from the friction of daily life. Each recollection compounded the growing awareness of her negligence, highlighting a pattern of taking for granted a person whose presence and actions were extraordinary. In her reflection, she began to see patterns she had once dismissed: the way he had mediated arguments with calm precision, absorbed tensions she had created, and consistently sought to uplift rather than criticize. These gestures, once invisible in the rhythm of everyday life, now stood out as acts of profound generosity, evidence of a character and patience that she could scarcely match. The more she examined the past, the clearer it became that her life had been cushioned by a continuous, deliberate kindness, one that she had failed to honor or reciprocate with awareness. The realization provoked both regret and introspection, compelling her to confront her own entitlement, selfishness, and failure to appreciate what had been offered freely and without demand. She began to feel the emotional cost of her neglect, not as abstract guilt but as a tangible absence in the texture of daily interactions. The spaces where his kindness had been unacknowledged now felt stark and hollow, highlighting the delicate balance he had maintained and the fragility of the goodwill she had assumed was inexhaustible. Every small memory of his attentiveness preparing her favorite meal, quietly taking over a tedious chore, offering reassurance during moments of anxiety resonated with a new gravity. She saw the extraordinary effort hidden in the ordinary, the thoughtfulness embedded in routine, and the rarity of a partner who could sustain such consistency. Social contexts added another layer to her reflection. Friends and acquaintances had often observed his patience and reliability, commenting on his attentiveness and support, and she recognized that while outsiders had noticed these qualities, she had remained blind to the extraordinary constancy that had shaped the very ease and comfort of her life. The contrast between her neglect and his unwavering care became painfully evident. Emotional distance, though subtle, began to emerge between them. He had not withdrawn out of malice, but in response to her unawareness, creating a gentle, almost imperceptible boundary, protecting his own emotional energy while allowing her to come to the realization she had long delayed. She felt the impact of this withdrawal acutely, Moments that had been seamless now required effort, gestures that had been automatic now prompted consideration, and the invisible scaffolding of her daily life seemed less secure. The subtle shift was a mirror, reflecting her own oversight back at her with clarity. Every missed acknowledgement, every overlooked act, every moment of her preoccupation with self-interest became a testament to the imbalance that had quietly grown. The chapter of reflection deepened as she confronted not only what she had taken for granted but also the emotional resilience he had exhibited. She understood that sustaining such generosity was not effortless. It required mindfulness, patience, and deliberate attention that few could maintain over time. This awareness intensified her internal reckoning as she began to see how easily rare kindness could be eroded when met with indifference. In solitary moments, she replayed the dynamics of their shared life, the ease of their routines, the comfort of his attention, the subtle yet profound ways he had anticipated and mitigated difficulties for her sake. Each recollection was weighted with a new understanding of its significance, highlighting how her obliviousness had allowed the extraordinary to blend seamlessly into the ordinary, masking its true value. The realization provoked a sense of urgency and self-reproach. She grasped that her continued inattention might risk the erosion of a foundation that had been painstakingly maintained over years. As the chapter progressed, her reflections became a tapestry of acknowledgement. She recognized the consistent, deliberate, and rare nature of his kindness, the subtle ways it had shaped her life, and the potential permanence of loss if her appreciation did not catch up with her awareness. The day-to-day constancy she had overlooked was now illuminated in stark relief, revealing the depth of care she had taken for granted and the profound rarity of a partner whose every choice reflected empathy, patience, and commitment. By the time she fully recognized the depth of what she had taken for granted, the dynamics between them had shifted in ways that were no longer subtle. His patience, once seemingly endless, had begun to manifest in measured restraint rather than effortless generosity. Where he had previously anticipated her needs, he now paused, waiting for her to acknowledge or request, testing whether she had truly internalized the value of his presence and effort. Each gesture she had once assumed as automatic was now consciously offered, and the absence of immediate, unquestioned care was startling. She began to feel the weight of the emotional labor he had silently carried for years, the countless small decisions, sacrifices, and acts of thoughtfulness that had sustained not only her comfort but the harmony of their shared life. Every delayed response, every slight hesitation, and every act of measured kindness became a mirror reflecting her own past indifference. She saw clearly how her obliviousness had created a silent imbalance, one that had gone unnoticed until his boundaries gently but firmly asserted themselves. Attempts to regain the sense of normalcy she had once enjoyed were met with careful evaluation on his part. He was no longer operating from pure instinct or unconditional patience, and she realized the true rarity of the constancy she had dismissed. The realization brought with it a flood of regret and self-reproach. She remembered moments when she had been preoccupied, impatient, or distracted, failing to recognize the effort behind his unwavering support, and the impact of those moments became painfully clear. She understood that his continued kindness had been contingent upon her acknowledgement and reciprocity, both of which she had previously withheld. Emotional awareness intensified as she observed the subtle changes in his demeanor. His smiles, once warm and effortless, now carried a hint of caution, as if measuring the depth of her appreciation. His words, always careful and supportive, seemed more intentional, less automatic, and she felt the absence of the ease that had previously defined their interactions. This absence was more than symbolic. It signaled a recalibration of the emotional economy in their relationship, an adjustment to account for years of unacknowledged devotion emotion. She began to trace the patterns of her own behavior, realizing that each slight dismissal, each overlooked effort, and each moment of self-centeredness had contributed to a slow erosion of the effortless generosity that had characterized his presence. The weight of this recognition pressed upon her, creating an internal urgency to rectify the imbalance. Yet she understood that some gestures, once taken for granted, could not be reclaimed simply through apology or acknowledgement. The realization was compounded by observing the ways in which others noticed and appreciated him. Friends, family, and colleagues had long recognized the thoughtfulness and patience he exhibited, often commenting on his rare qualities, and yet she had failed to internalize their significance. Their observations now acted as a catalyst for deeper introspection, highlighting how extraordinary his kindness had been and how easily she had overlooked it. In private moments, she reflected on the myriad ways he had adapted his life to support her, the sacrifices of personal time, the quiet deflection of his own discomforts, and the constant, unspoken attention to her needs. Each recollection brought with it both sorrow and reverence, as she realized the magnitude of what she had assumed as commonplace. Attempts at reconciliation or improvement became a delicate endeavor. She sought to express gratitude, to acknowledge past negligence, and to demonstrate awareness of his rare qualities, yet she quickly recognized that her actions alone could not undo the subtle shift that had already taken place. He remained cautious, his generosity now filtered through awareness of her previous inattentiveness, and she felt the weight of the rarity of what she had once taken for granted. The chapter unfolded as a delicate exploration of recognition, remorse, and tentative restoration. She experienced the duality of understanding, admiration for his constancy and regret for her previous blindness. The impact of her realization was both emotional and practical, as daily interactions required greater awareness, intentionality, and effort to match the depth of his ongoing care. Each day, she confronted the challenge of honoring the rarity of his patience and attentiveness, understanding that genuine kindness, once diminished by neglect, required careful cultivation and conscious acknowledgement to sustain. Through this process, she began to internalize a new ethic of gratitude, empathy, and intentional recognition, realizing that the lessons she was learning now were not abstract but necessary to preserve and respect the extraordinary qualities he had long exhibited. In this chapter, the tension between past negligence and present awareness defined her internal landscape, a mix of admiration, regret, humility, and the urgent desire to ensure that future actions reflected a true appreciation for the rare and precious kindness that had sustained her for so long. Every gesture she attempted now carried the weight of acknowledgement, a conscious effort to align her awareness with the depth of his prior generosity, and a growing understanding that such rare care demanded not only recognition but active participation in its preservation. Time passed, and the weight of realization settled firmly in her consciousness, altering the way she moved through their shared life. Each gesture he now offered was intentional, measured, and precise, and she could no longer take anything for granted. She observed how his attentiveness, once automatic, required conscious effort, and she felt the sting of understanding that the effortless care she had relied upon for years was a rarity that demanded constant emotional investment. Her reflections deepened into a profound awareness that his patience, kindness, and quiet support had been extraordinary, a precious gift she had overlooked until confronted by its subtle withdrawal. She began to catalog every small act she had ignored, the gentle reminders of self-care, the quiet adjustments he made to accommodate her comfort, the sacrifices of time and energy he had absorbed silently to maintain harmony. Each memory became a testament to the magnitude of his care, revealing the extraordinary effort that had sustained her life and their relationship in ways she had assumed were ordinary. In the spaces where she once relied on his generosity without notice, she now felt the absence acutely, recognizing how much she had depended upon him and how fragile the balance had become. The realization was suffused with both regret and awe. Regret for her previous indifference, awe for the remarkable constancy he had maintained despite it. She began to understand that true kindness is not limitless, that it requires recognition, reciprocation, and respect, and that failing to honor it can slowly erode its presence. With this understanding, she approached her own behavior with intentionality, seeking to align her actions with a newfound appreciation for the depth of his generosity. Simple acts of acknowledgement, expressions of gratitude, mindful attention to his efforts, and deliberate reciprocity became both necessary and urgent. She recognized that repairing the subtle rift created by years of unawareness required consistent effort, and that the restoration of balance was not instantaneous but a gradual cultivation of respect and recognition. The emotional landscape of their relationship shifted as she applied this awareness, noticing how his responsiveness and warmth subtly adjusted in response to her own attentiveness. Where once her indifference had been invisible, now the dynamic demanded conscious interaction, a deliberate honoring of the kindness that had been rare and exceptional all along. As she engaged in this process, she felt a mix of humility and reverence, acknowledging not only her own failings but also the rare qualities he possessed: patience beyond expectation, attentiveness without demand, and a generosity that had sustained her life quietly, persistently, and beautifully. Reflection deepened as she considered the broader implications of what she had learned: that human kindness, when taken for granted, is not inexhaustible, and that the subtle erosion of care can have profound consequences. She internalized the lesson that appreciation must be active and continuous, and that true partnership requires acknowledgement and participation in the maintenance of the extraordinary qualities that underpin trust, love, and stability. In private moments, she revisited the past with clarity, recognizing patterns of her own neglect, the countless gestures she had failed to notice, and the enduring patience he had shown despite it. Each recollection reinforced the rarity of his character and the responsibility she now carried to honor it. The chapter unfolded as a journey of emotional maturation, from unawareness to recognition, from neglect to acknowledgement, and from passive receipt of kindness to active engagement in its preservation. By the close of this chapter, she had cultivated a new consciousness of gratitude, humility, and respect, understanding that sustaining a relationship with someone of such rare generosity required deliberate awareness and consistent action. She saw that the depth of his kindness was not simply a backdrop to her life, but a foundational element demanding recognition, reverence, and careful maintenance. Every small act, every measured gesture, every moment of attentiveness was now visible to her, and she approached their shared life with a renewed sense of responsibility, striving to ensure that her awareness and actions matched the extraordinary generosity she had previously taken for granted. The quiet, deliberate efforts she began to make reflected a transformation in perspective, a shift from passive reliance to active appreciation, from unconscious consumption to mindful participation in a relationship built upon the rarest of human virtues. In this chapter, she internalized the full weight of loss and possibility, the cost of previous neglect, and the potential for redemption through acknowledgement, care, and reverence, leaving her with a profound, enduring understanding of what it truly means to recognize and honor the rarity of genuine kindness.
Thanks for watching. It means a lot. Share the video, and I'll see you soon.